I'm Em Sutter, better known as Pints and Panels.
And I'm Don Tess, better known as the Dawn of Beer.
Welcome to episode 46 of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on the show, we're talking about a very sexy topic. All the kids are talking about because it's got a lot of riz, attenuation. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/allaboutbeer, to support this show and others. So Don, what do you think about attenuation?
I think it is a dry subject.
I walked into that one. My knowledge of attenuation, and we'll get into it, is I really messed up on a social media post recently, and we'll talk about that. And I had to issue a retraction and an apology, and it was about attenuation. So I thought, you know what? Hell,
Let's figure this out.
Let's figure this out together as a group, as a family, and try to figure out to explain attenuation, perceived sweetness, and dry this, so we'll all be smarter together. But first, if you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of supporting the show, here's a word from our sponsors.
Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. They're all about lager, rooted in the German brewing heritage. Maintaining their commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their original brewery in La Coruña, Spain. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. They shun high-gravity tricks and avoid additives, even in their alcohol-free beers, and stick firmly to traditional methods. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference and learn more on Instagram at Estrella Galicia, USA.
Jen Blair is a Master Cicerone and National BJCP judge. She is the exam manager for the Cicerone certification program and the co-host of False Bottom Girls, a podcast about beer and brewing. She is a judge for the Great American Beer Festival, Festival of Barrel-Aged Beer, and World Beer Cup. Her work in training and empowering people historically excluded from beer judging and other beer spaces has earned her recognition as a Good Beer Hunting 2021 signifier, as well as inclusion in the Vine Pair 50, Wine Enthusiast Future 40, and Imbibe's Top 75 list. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So the reason that this episode is occurring is because I don't know what attenuation is. And I really screwed the pooch on that by creating a thing that said that attenuation and dryness were the same thing. They are not. So can you explain what attenuation is and how it is related to dryness, and explain it for me, the person who did not do so well in science?
Sure. Well, as a person who also did not do so well in science, I can do a pretty good layperson explanation for you. So attenuation, the definition of it is the measure of the amount of sugars that have been consumed by yeast during fermentation. And that, that can give you an idea of what the finish is going to be like, but there are going to be other factors that's going to affect whether a beer finishes dry, whether it finishes sweet, and that is related to attenuation, but it is not a one-for-one with attenuation.
So what else is there?
Yeah.
Well,
that's our next question. It says, what other
perfect.
factors are there?
Yeah. So when we're talking about finish, and I have to say, one thing I've found interesting about the concept of dry as a descriptor, I don't really love it because I think most people kind of have an idea of what it means. And you know when something finishes dry, you kind of learn what that feeling is like. But actually the concept of something being dry is from the four humors. So that's like leftover from humoral medicine. Back, when it was like, you've got too much black bile, you need to
you
eat
got to
and
watch
drink.
out for, you got to watch out for your yellow blood or whatever.
Right, exactly. And so that's where the concept of dry, and like when we say spicy foods are hot, that's the same kind of thing. I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole on this, but I'm kind of known for harping on sort of vague descriptors. Dry is one of those for me. But a lot of times when we're saying that something has a dry finish, what we're meaning is that the almost all of the fermentable sugars have been fermented out, right? So it has good attenuation. And if something finishes on the sweeter side, that, that can indicate several things. If you want it to finish on the sweeter side, then you can add unfermentable sugars like lactose, right? So the yeast will not eat lactose. Lactose doesn't usually add that much of a flavor to the beer, but it will add that sweet mouthfeel. You can also do things like mash at a higher temperature. So during your mash, you're extracting more of those long chain sugars that a lot of yeast will not eat. So when we're talking about attenuation and how that will affect the finish of the beer, it's also going to depend on the yeast strain. So a lot or most, all brewers yeast really are going to be able to ferment the different sugars in the beer at different rates. And one of the, I think probably the best analogy I've ever seen is Dr. Laura Burns of Omega Yeast describes it as the dinner plate. So when you're choosing your yeast strain, you can set up your dinner plate. And, that's going to be where your maltose, right? That's going to be the most abundant sugar that's going to be found in your wort. Your maltose is, kind of like the protein, right? And like the maltotriose is, I don't know, maybe the carb or like the peas and carrots or something. And then you've also got like glucose, dextrin, and different yeast strains are going to eat those different sugars in different proportions. So looking for something that is going to, finish really dry. Maybe like something like a Belgian strain that's got more capability of eating those more complex sugars would be a good choice for you. You can also, like I mentioned, you can have like a lower mash temperature or even a lower mash pH. So there are a lot of levers you can pull to affect how the attenuation is going to affect the finish of your beer. And it's kind of like with there's so many parameters in brewing, and attenuation is really just one of those that you can use when you're trying to figure out like, okay, what do I want this overall impression of this beer to be?
But I'm still not understanding how attenuation and dryness are different.
Sure. So there are other factors within your beer that can affect that perception of dryness, right? If let's say you've got something with like roasted malts in it that's going to have some astringency, that can lead to a mouthfeel that's going to tend to be more dry. But really with attenuation, like I said, you could have, let's say you're making a beer that you're making a milk stout, right? So you're putting lactose in. Your beer can your beer can fully ferment, can attenuate exactly as planned, but it's still going to be a very sweet beer because it's got that lactose in there that the yeast is not going to eat. So if you're aiming for a dry beer, then I would say the attenuation is a little bit more one for one, right? But you could also have, let's say you have a beer that has some caramel malt in it, right? That's also going to give you some of those residual sugars. So it's going to lend to a sweeter finish.
But then I would argue it's not as attenuated, is it not?
No, it would still be attenuated to the degree, hopefully, your average apparent attenuation. It will still be attenuated to that because the yeast has eaten the sugars it's supposed to eat.
Okay, so attenuation is the sugars that the yeast is capable of eating. What has it eaten?
Right.
And then so you could still have residual, you could have a fully attenuated beer that still has sugar, for example, lactose or
Correct.
dextrose, or not dextrose, dextrins. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, there's also perceived sweetness,
Right.
which was going to be my next question, which is a lot of people are like, well, the thing you made was wrong because you're missing perceived sweetness. And this word perceived gets bandied about a lot with IBU, which again, Don, that's a topic for where we were talking
Yes.
about perceived bitterness earlier. So yeah, it's like how does perceived sweetness kind of fit into the overall picture and why does that matter?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, you can have unfermentable sugars, and that's going to impact your perceived sweetness. You can also have things like caramel malts, dextrin malts that are there to add to the sweetness. Of course, you can also have low perceived bitterness, and that's going to affect, with the kind of the sweet bitter balance. And, you can, if you've got something like fruit or, any kind of adjunct that can add a perception of sweetness to the beer as well.
What about alcohol? Does ABV have any role to play in that? Or
Yes,
not?
ABV, yeah, ABV can. So as your ABV is getting higher, your yeast is going to be more stressed out, right? So when you're selecting your yeast strain for your beer, if you're looking for something that's higher alcohol, let's say 8% or above, then you need to, select a yeast strain that can handle that level of alcohol. Because what we're really doing, like the yeast doesn't care about your beer, right? The yeast is trying to survive, and we're stressing it out, and that's how we're getting the ethanol and the CO2. So as your alcohol rises, your yeast is going to have a harder time because we're creating more of a toxic environment for that yeast.
But alcohol itself has a little bit of sweetness to it, doesn't it? Or at least we perceive it that way.
Yeah, I think really with alcohol, it's kind of like the astringency, right? So it's going to have an alcohol warming sensation. That's going to be your trigeminal sense rather than your sense of taste.
Right.
But that still, I think, can lead to kind of that perception of sweetness. So I think you're exactly right. It can impact how sweet something tastes, just because in our brains, we also kind of link those two together.
So we were sort of talking about IBUs and other measures. Apparent attenuation, measured as a percentage. It obviously brewers need to know it and think about it, but for consumers, if attenuation is not necessarily related to perceived sweetness, is apparent attenuation a number that is useful to consumers? Should brewers be putting it on their cans the same way they put IBUs on their cans?
No, what I will say, first of all, I don't think anybody should be putting IBUs on cans.
Thank you.
I
agree
yeah.
with you.
Well, this isn't
IBUs are like
2014 anymore.
right,
So
right. And the measurement of IBU is a very specific
Yes.
measurement that's done in a lab under controlled conditions. So putting IBUs does not communicate anything to your customers. So I don't think IBUs, I don't think apparent attenuation either, just because for the average customer, that's not information that people, we're on this podcast right now. Both of you are really well versed in beer, and we're still having a conversation about attenuation. Imagine if that was on the can, people would be like, I don't know what this is. And, I also think putting apparent attenuation on your products could, maybe get you into trouble if maybe you're not brewing your beers as consistently as you would like. Not that you would necessarily change, the apparent attenuation on every single label, but yeah, I don't think so. And, with apparent attenuation, one thing that I can share in my experience as a beer judge is, I remember at a competition judging a beer and thinking, okay, this seems like it has a lot of residual sugar in it. So I was like, you know what? I bet this is under attenuated. And, one of the first things you learn as a beer judge is, or you should learn, is that you don't make assumptions about the brewing process. So, your feedback, your perceptions are kind of couched in if-then statements. So, if your yeast didn't attenuate enough, maybe try a healthier yeast strain, whatever. And I remember telling people like this tastes a little under attenuated, and they were like, well, I hit all my numbers. I hit my attenuation, and then later on learning like, oh yeah, if you have like too much caramel malt in there or, or whatever, there are other factors that can lead to your beer seeming like it has a lot of residual sweetness. So then, I just changed the feedback I was giving people, like maybe this is under attenuated, maybe change the proportions of caramel malts in your recipe. And I share that as an example of, apparent attenuation can kind of give you information as a consumer, but not really, right? Because there's so many other unknown factors that as a consumer, you don't know. So I don't think that would be something helpful for consumers to know.
Okay, thank you.
Can you talk about certain styles being more attenuated than others? You touched on this briefly with Belgian styles.
Mhm.
But is there other like I know in my mind, like milk stouts have the least amount of attenuation because of the lactose, and then there's like American styles. The average attenuation percentage number in my mind is like 75%. But
Mhm.
could you just maybe mention a couple of styles and they're like since you're a master cicerone, I'm sure that you know this. Like the amount of attenuation and like so what are we looking for in terms of like a regular like an IPA versus a goose versus tropical like I don't
Right.
normal styles.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So anything I would say, so the first thing that pops in my head is something like a double IPA, right? When I brew my double IPA recipe, I add a couple of pounds of dextrose because the yeast is going to eat that dextrose and it's going to give me higher alcohol, without a lot of like, it's not going to add flavor, it's not going to add body, and it's going to be very well attenuated. Again, other parameters that I would control for would be a lower mash temperature, lower mash pH, so I can extract as many of those fermentable sugars as I can for my yeast. Something like a goose that has like Brettanomyces, it's been a mixed fermentation, particularly with Brettanomyces. Brettanomyces will eat residual sugars that regular brewers' yeast will not eat, especially as you give it more time. So, if you had the opportunity to like buy 2 bottles of goose at one time, drink one right away, make notes on it, and then save the other one for even just a year or so and taste that, you'll see that the finish is going to be a lot drier. And that's because the Brett in the bottle has continued to eat away of those residual sugars. So something like a goose or a lambic that's going to have Brettanomyces in it can, start to approach like a, 1.000 gravity reading. And I would put something like a double IPA, kind of up toward that end of it's going to be much drier. And then you've got things like, well, also if your beer is, or if your yeast strain has diastaticus, which hopefully it doesn't, but that diastaticus will also continue to eat those residual sugars that like a regular brewer's yeast won't eat. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like British ale yeasts. Those don't have a very high degree of attenuation, which if you think about, a lot of British ales, they do tend to be a little bit sweeter than maybe like Belgian or German or United States beer styles. And then, another factor, and I won't go too deep down this rabbit hole, but another factor that comes into play with something like a British ale is that they're very high flocculating, which means that the yeast is going to fall out of suspension a lot quicker than it will for, let's say, like an American ale yeast strain. So what that means then is if your yeast is not in suspension, right, it's not eating those sugars. So you're going to have a lower attenuation rate.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That was good. I love listening to you talk about beer, Jen. You're such a like I'm serious. You're such
Thank you.
you're a smart cookie. And I mean that like in a compliment, not in like a weird. I really when I said smart cookie, I was like, that's weird. Anyway, I have one more question for you. What do you wish consumers knew about attenuation and dryness? Like I mean you touched on it briefly about like people tasting dry, but they're not sure like what's going on.
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of people are like, this is dry, and it's like, is it? What do you wish casual consumers and beer drinkers understood more about attenuation?
Um, Gosh, that's a really good question. So I would say one thing, I'm very big into quality and consistency.
You
And
sure are.
if, yeah, if, something is rushed to market, right? And that's, sometimes that's a reality, particularly if you're a really small brewer and you need to get beer out to the market. Maybe that beer hasn't finished like fully fermenting, so it's not completely attenuated. And, you might taste something like a double IPA and be like, wow, this is a lot sweeter than I thought a double IPA was. Not to say that if you do that, you should be like, can I speak to the brewer? I have opinions about this. But, sometimes that really like under attenuated beer, again, possibly could be an indication that, this beer was rushed, that this beer just needed to get out to market and quality was kind of a secondary concern. So I would like for customers to keep that in mind, and then the other thing is stuff like attenuation. It is important to have kind of a general grasp, right? So after you've listened to this podcast episode, you're going to have a general grasp of attenuation. And so the next time, let's say you have that double IPA that has that nice dry finish, or let's say like a Saison, right? Saisons are known for their dry finish. You can feel that like that dry finish and be like, aha, this beer has been well attenuated, which means that the yeast strain that whatever the brewer chose has done its job correctly and has been allowed to do its job correctly.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Thank you
Which
for
sometimes
that.
means patience, right? The brewer was
Yes.
patient. Yeah, love it. Awesome. Thank you.
Exactly.
Jen, where can people learn more about what you do? Social media, website, newsletter?
Yes, so you can find me on social media at Under the Genfluence. I do have a website. I think I haven't been there in a couple of weeks. Underthegenfluence.beer. And I do also have a monthly newsletter on Substack, and you can find it. I think you can just find it by searching for Under the Genfluence. My monthly newsletter is a mix. I always try to put something sensory related in it. Actually, this month was about perceived bitterness and something more of like a social issue or an advocacy issue within the beer industry.
Great.
Cool.
Thank you, Jen, for your time. We really appreciate. I understand attenuation a little better now because of you, and I'm appreciative of that. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you both
you.
for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for entertaining us with this dry subject.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Bye, Jen.
All right. Thanks, Jen.
Bye.
And we'll be right back with Brandon Jones of Yazoo Brewing right after a word from our sponsors.
The origins of Estrella Galicia date back to 1906, the date on which Jose Maria Rivera Corral founded the first beer and ice factory in La Coruña after his return from immigration to Mexico. Estrella Galicia recalled its business in the city of Veracruz, advocating for a product that at the time had very limited consumption, but that ended up becoming a part of the habits of all Spaniards. In the 1920s, the mechanization process of the first factory began with the help of Mr. Ramon Rivera, son of the founder, who was one of the first Spaniards to obtain the title of Master Brewer. The third generation of the Rivera family in 1970 decided to build a new factory on the industrial estate of Algradia in the same city, fully equipped with the latest advances in the brewing sector. Experience the difference and know more about Estrella Galicia by visiting them on Instagram at Estrella Galicia USA.
Founder of the largest independently owned professional wild beer program in southern USA, Brandon Jones is a renowned proponent of the art and science of funky fermentation. In 2010, Jones launched Embrace the Funk blog to dispel misinformation about sour, funky, and wild beer styles. His Yazoo Brewing Funk Fest is the longest consecutively run sour, funky, and wild beer festival/education seminar series in the U.S. In 2023, Brandon launched a new line of ciders called Painted Porch, a base, imperial, and cherry variety. These three core ciders pride themselves on using a local Nashville yeast strain, and a specific blend of northeastern USA apples and Tennessee apple juice. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Hey guys, good afternoon, good morning, wherever we are. How's it going today?
Good, good. Thanks for coming on the show to talk about attenuation. So my
Yes.
first question is, you guys, Yazoo Brewing is known for mixed fermentation.
Yes.
How does attenuation and dryness play into the beers that you make?
It plays a lot, especially in the beginning when we're developing a new recipe, whether it be on the mixed farm side or the clean side of beers. So on the mixed farm side, if there's a new recipe that I'm thinking about, attenuation plays a part in every bit of the recipe, whether it comes to water or grain selection or IBUs. What we found early on when we were trying to scale up, a little over a decade ago, scaling up some of my recipes, we were still getting the same attenuation, but because a lot of those recipes were developed on a system that is direct fire, which had a lot of kettle caramelization to it, that tended to add a lot more perceivable body to a very dry beer that was maybe at zero Plato. Well, the Big Brew House here is a steam Calandria, So you're not going to get that same kettle caramelization. So we did have to make some adjustments on, on the recipes with malts, with, backing off on some of the IBUs of the beers because it did come off some of the first batches of Saison. While they did age out very nicely young when we were trying to release them, I thought were a little bit too sharp and bitter. Thinking about the clean side of things, where our beers end 2 to 3 Plato a lot of times. You can pack a lot more IBUs in there because you do have that offset of not that hyper attenuation that we get with the mixed firm beers and the dryness from the oak. So, we can play a little bit more with higher IBUs, a lot more sharpness in the beers, depending on if we're doing the West Coast or maybe, a nice hoppy lager.
So, you're kind of talking about attenuation and dryness as concepts, which is great. Thank you. You mentioned IBU a few times, which is a sort of measure of bitterness. I'm going to argue how important IBU is on another episode someday. But in terms of dryness, are you thinking of it in general concept like that, or are you actually measuring it like with apparent attenuation? Are you trying to seek out numbers, or is it just
Um,
go ahead?
Well, yes and yes. We measure, so I measure it through density, a density meter over here at the cellar. So I know exactly, where we start, where we end. But the attenuation, I mean, pretty much any beer that we make over here is going to finish under 1 Plato at the cellar.
Oh,
I mean, it just um, with all the different microbes that go into it, the diastaticus yeast that go into our saisons and Belgian ales. Especially since we're packaging now a lot of it in aluminum cans, we have to make sure that they are very, they're very shelf stable because we are producing a lot of cans these days of mixed firm beer. So yeah, the closer that we get to zero on it, sure. Yeah, we absolutely have to be really cautious and be diligent about measuring where the beer is stabilizing at. And I don't think we've packaged anything over here at the cellar above maybe 1.5 Plato ever. We did have an old recipe, an old school recipe I got from Ron Pattinson that I believe was finished around 1.5 Plato after a year that I was still unsure of. So I did put it in champagne bottles, but it did stabilize and it never moved. So after packaging, it was still same. We measured the density and it was still the same. So, but
Hmm.
yeah, it is. But yes and yes when I answer that, because I look at it as we're going to put it in oak, so you're going to have an inherent character of dryness. A lot of times with the depending on how long it's in oak, of the sort of oak astringency for a little bit of brain fog this morning on describing it. But then you when you start getting down to like sub 1 Plato, you really have to be mindful of your of how much bitterness is in the final beer when you go to package. So a lot of it is at play to build it in. Our beer low-cal that we do, the low calorie sort of wildish ale that we do with the natural native yeast is a diastaticus yeast, and that beer is only it's only like a 3.5% beer, so it starts at what 7 something Plato, and it will end at
oh,
zero. So you have a lot of you don't have a lot of malt there to play on. So that's why when I know it's going to end at the attenuation is going to be darn near 100% attenuation. We don't want it to be watery, especially at that AB, or I'm sorry, that ABV, because it could come up as watery and thin and just a big bunch of messy nothing. So then we start looking at putting in ingredients like, that's why we use the flaked rye in there, and because that will build in some body, so it doesn't come off watery. So yeah, that definitely plays a huge part, especially in these low ABV table beers that I particularly love doing, because that is a challenge for me. And I've spoken about this to a lot of folks that I love making sub 4% beers, because I think they're a lot more difficult to make than a 6 to 7, 8% beer, because you don't have much to hide behind. You have to show how you can build a drinkable beer that people want multiple glasses or cans of. that's still interesting and not just, a bunch of nothing in it. There's plenty of beers out there. They're a bunch of nothing. I don't want to make that. I want to make something that's still interesting and still, still a good value that, again, is dry. I love dry beers. I don't like sweet beers really at all. So, I mean, give me all the dry beers. I love them.
Okay, I've got a couple follow-ups from that. So you were talking about how you're trying to get to close to zero with the mixed firm. Does that mean apparent attenuation is like almost 100%? And then my second follow-up is you're talking about low cal, where you're starting with, and I think in specific gravity. So you're saying 7 degrees, which is I think 1028, and then you're getting a 3.5% beer out of that. But you're using rye and other things. So the rye is contributing some unfermentable sugars to create the body. And does that then lower your apparent attenuation again?
Yeah, I mean, I think low-cal usually finishes at around a half a Plato. So it's still very, very low.
Yeah.
I consider, pretty much anything under 1.5, a pretty dry beer, regardless. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first forgot the first
Oh,
question that you asked.
with the mixed firm, if you're saying you get close to zero, does that mean the apparent attenuation is almost 100%?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what I aim for in most of the beers. Beers like our Flanders Red, Deruges, that it uses a lot of dark caramelized malts. Now that'll still be like a one, slightly over 1 Plato beer. It tends to dry out a lot, but then we still get, because we use fresh Merlot barrels with that, so we still get that juicy berryness out of the Merlot. Then we go in, then you start out talking about adding different fruits, and different fruits will build in, certain mouthfeel, with the different pectin levels, and just based upon how acidic those fruits are. Once you remove all the sugars from it, a passion fruit people think is very sweet fruit, but I can guarantee you that when you ferment it out and you remove the sugars, it's a pretty tart fruit.
Yeah.
So you have to think about, your attenuation levels and think about where the beer is going to end up, even, when you're adding fruits and adjuncts that won't just, sit there and not ferment out.
Speaking of fruit, so thank you for the follow-up. You do cider now, which is so I wanted to ask how attenuation plays into making ciders, since it's a different I guess it's not brewing, but a different fermentation process. So do you think about attenuation when you're making these dry, if you make a dry cider, what goes into doing that?
Yeah, so we have 3 right now with the Paint and Porch cider line that we just launched this year. It sort of goes back to the French style ciders that I've been lucky to be able to sip on during my trips to Belgium and other parts of Europe. I really love a dry, even from wine. I love dry white wines. So I love dry cider. So the yeast that we use is the same yeast in portion that we use in low-cal. So it is that native natural yeast that we begin the fermentation with, and then we'll stagger in a little bit of a white wine yeast just to kind of get it all the way down. But that cider is done over here at the barrel cellar and not at the main brewery. So we don't really want to bring into our main brewery diastaticus yeast. So that's why we kind of separate the ciders and all the ETF line over here at the barrel cellar and not at the main brewery, because the volume that we do, and that doesn't get picked up. Now, thankfully, we do have a great lab manager and some great lab equipment now, and that could be picked up pretty quickly. But if the batch is already going, we two 400 barrel batches are that's a pretty big loss. So that is attenuation in the beers here is quite different than the attenuation that we're looking for at the main brewery. So that is why we also do the ciders over here at the barrel cellar, because we don't need that hyper attenuation, that sort of, I guess that would be considered a spoilage yeast, in a beer like Dos Perros or Gerst. So yeah, that's a big reason why we do, and we keep it separate and separate. All the packaging line is different. The kegging line is different over here, so we're very cautious on that, as to make sure that all the products stay pure, and the attenuation on ciders is stays, in the ciders, which figures they usually end up kind of negative. I don't think we've had anything finish above 0 Plato, so they
Nice.
mostly end negative. We
That's
certainly don't want that on a on a batch of Sioux, our smoked imperial porter. So that would be terrible. So
So I've got one more question for you. Since you do make a lot of dry products, how do you educate your consumers about attenuation or dryness? Do you have your beer tenders explain it when you pour in a tasting room? Or, I mean, or is it just, does that not even matter? People kind of know when they taste dry what it is. So, I mean, I'm not sure if you have any kind of educational thing you do
yeah, well,
for
I think
that stuff.
it's yes to all of the above, and it's very beer or cider dependent. Now we've been very upfront on the ciders; they're all dry. And having just three of them, we do have it on the menu. But I try to when we launch a beer, I try to give a three use three words to describe it with. I think that's if I have to use more than three words to describe what I'm making, then I've probably you know I probably made something ridiculous, and I
Hmm.
don't like to do that. So I would use words like you know with the semi dry, tart. I think tart kind of expresses in my world, yes, it does express a bit of acidity in there, but tart and dry can be pretty interchangeable for some people's palates, was what I've noticed. I never would have thought about that years ago, but I've seen people um, taste a beer that was very dry, a single fermented yeast beer, and say, "Oh, well, that's tart," And there are some yeasts that, yes, they are hypertonic, but that's just part of their natural expression is to throw a tart character in there, and so they associate, tart with dry too, which I can see that because it kind of dries out, saliva on your tongue. I can see how you could get that. So yes, we usually go over with the folks in the tap room. The day of we launch, our general manager will let everybody know what's new on the menu. The menu has a nice descriptor, and then we usually try to have the three words: dry, tart, crisp, or dry, tart, citrusy. Um, if it's our dark sour beer, we would use words like um, rounded, stone fruits, you know, acidic, something like that, just going on top of my head.
Hmm.
So, the word rounded to me in my world and putting it on a menu, I found that kind of jives with people on not expecting a beer that is super dry, but also not expecting, a malt, a multi malt bomb.
Hmm.
Sure.
I like that.
Awesome.
We're
Yeah,
writers, power of words.
for sure.
I always try to think of any adjective I can, just that it's a simple way to express it. Again, I like the three word approach to it, and I think that resonates with somebody who's quickly looking over a menu um, to try to make a decision on what they want. So usually, if you can hit them on the first two or three words, then they probably picked out a beer that they know that they enjoy, a style that they're probably going to feel good that they purchased.
Yeah, I really like that three-word thing that you just mentioned. I mean, I think a lot of people think, particularly with mixed firm, they're so complicated. The flavors are very complex, and yet,
Sure.
um, in terms of approachability and consumer acceptance, you need to be able to distill it down to three words. I really like that.
Exactly, and then it's even more important now with the consumer that we have now. I think it's incredibly important to simplify it, because there are so many competing styles out there, competing with every new IPA and wildly adjunct imperial stout out there that has this going on and this going on, this going on. If I can just go sort of like a movie, like plot middle end with it, I think that breaks it down very quickly, and it makes it approachable because some people, it might be their first sour or wild beer. We don't know that. So I just always try to make it as simple and as welcoming as possible into this world, and that's what I've tried to do for 15 years now, from writing the ETF blog to what I do now. Is, again, I say it over and over, pull back that veil of mystery to it and just open it up and show people, yeah, this is what it should be. You may not like it, and I'm good if you don't like it for for accurate reasons. But here's what we have, and here's what we're going for. And if you don't particularly like it, I'm good with it. But you may love it based upon these characters. The person that taught me to simplify everything down in mixed culture and sour beer is Lauren Limbeck from New Belgium. She is the one that always told me to use the simplest, tasty terms possible.
Awesome.
I love that.
And she knows a little bit about things.
Yeah,
Totally.
she's not a newbie.
Yeah.
Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the program today. Where can people learn about Yazoo Brewing, Painted Porch? What are some social media handles, website?
Yeah, if you're in the Middle Tennessee area in Nashville, come visit us. The brewery is on 7 acres, right on the Cumberland River. Gorgeous views. We have a huge patio, over 25 taps of just Yazoo beers. A lot of one-offs, a lot of fun stuff. We have food there now from Grill Shack. You can find the Painted Porch ciders, and you can find the Embrace the Funk beers available on draft and to go. Most locations here in Middle Tennessee. We are rolling out into a few other states with the ciders. You can check out my social medias at Embrace the Funk. You can check out the ciders at Painted Porch Cider, and then the main brewery handle at Yazoo Brew.
Awesome. Thank you,
Great.
Brandon.
Excellent.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot,
Cheers.
guys.
Yeah, cheers. Don, do you think attenuation is still a dry subject, or
I do.
I mean, yeah, fair.
But,
All right, that's fair.
But no, I think it was important to get the words right, the semantics right, so that people can, I mean, if people are going to enjoy beer and socialize around it and talk about it, we need to use the words properly. So I think this was a good episode. I certainly learned a lot. And yourself?
I now understand where I went wrong, which is really great. It's fun to see that. It's fun. I mean, it's not fun to see the error of your ways, but it is, especially with beer. So now I can be a more thoughtful educator as a beer educator. And it was interesting to see the difference between learning about attenuation and then watching Brandon apply it in a brewing
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
That's really, really cool. I really
It's not an
enjoyed
accident,
that.
right? Yeah, he thinks about it. Yeah.
Especially with mixed fermentation and saisons. I mean, Jen mentioned saisons and the way that they're made, and then that's what they do. They make mixed fermentation saisons, and so it was cool to watch the learning, and then here's why it's important from a brewing standpoint.
I
So
would like to know if you're going to reissue your cartoon.
I actually was, while we were recording, I was thinking of I would issue it in a way where the wording, the beers would stay the same, but the wording would be different. So it would be about attenuation in beer from lowest to highest in apparent attenuation.
Okay.
So that's how it would go.
I look forward to seeing that.
Instead of just saying these are dry, because some of them are really not. Here's attenuation, and here are beers with low attenuation, and here are beers with high attenuation, and that's how I would reissue it. So
right, I'm looking forward to seeing that. I will retweet it when you send it out.
Ah, shucks, thank you. Visit allaboutbeer.com, and please follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And again, if you're feeling generous, visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/allaboutbeer, to support this show and others. And if you have any questions for the experts, email podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, and to inquire about supporting the show through advertising. Don, how can people reach out to you?
On X, Threads, and Instagram, I am at the Dawn of Beer, and I love receiving emails from our listeners. So please email me, don@thedawnofbeer.com. And you, Em?
I am at Pints and Panels across all social media, and my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. If you enjoy this show, please share it with your friends, post about us on social media, and like and subscribe to the show. Please help spread the word of good beer. And here's a final word from our sponsor.
The story of Estrella Galicia continues. In the 1990s, the fourth generation of the Rivera family took over, embarking on an unstoppable journey of diversification in products and services, coupled with the expansion of national and international markets that continue to this day. At the beginning of the 2000s, a pioneering project was launched to reactivate hop cultivation in Galicia. And in 2012, the fifth generation joined the company, promoting their beers to more than 30 international countries. In 2019, they opened Mega, not only a museum, but a space dedicated to celebrating the culture of beer. Estrella Galicia's history, marked by innovation and global presence, continues to evolve, capturing the essence of a legacy that transcends borders. Learn more about Estrella Galicia on Instagram by visiting Estrella Galicia USA.
This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers!
Cheers. So dry.